utter complacency, a Chancellor in denial. She speaks of stability. What planet is the Right Honourable Lady on? She has lurched from putting up taxes to destroying growth, to destroying headroom, to coming back to putting up more taxes, more growth destroyed. Round and round we go, like a fiscal twister ripping up everything in its path.
The fuel price fiasco, how Rachel Reeves walked into her own trap. There is something almost theatrical about watching a Chancellor of the Exchequer attempt to summon the petrol industry for a dressing down, only for the room to empty before she has even taken her seat. What unfolded in the corridors of Downing Street this week was not merely political embarrassment. It was a masterclass in how to engineer a crisis out of thin air, dress it up as consumer advocacy, and then wonder why the people you invited to the meeting decided they would rather not come. Welcome to British Coffers, the channel that cuts through the noise, follows the money, and asks the questions that polite company tends to avoid. If you are new here, do consider subscribing. We cover UK politics and economics with the kind of clarity that Westminster would rather you did not have. Now, let us get into it. Rachel Reeves found herself in a rather uncomfortable position this week, and the irony is that she built the trap herself.
Reformed our visa system to bring the brightest and the best to Britain. Changed our fiscal rules that we inherited from the Conservatives. And in last year's budget, I raised taxes on business and the wealthiest to close the £22 billion black hole in the public finances left by the party opposites.
The Chancellor, faced with rising fuel prices and a public understandably anxious about costs in the context of ongoing Middle East tensions, decided to take a very visible stance. She wrote to the Competition and Markets Authority demanding it remain on what she called high alert for unjustifiable price hikes. She warned that she would not tolerate any company exploiting the current situation to make excess profits at consumers' expense. Stirring language. Photogenic politics. The problem, as is so often the case with this government, is that the rhetoric got ahead of the reality. The Petrol Retailers Association, which represents thousands of independent forecourt operators across the United Kingdom, was invited to Downing Street for a meeting with both the Chancellor and Energy Secretary Ed Miliband. A summit, essentially, on fuel pricing. The government presumably envisaged something tidy: concerned ministers, cooperative industry figures, a joint statement about fairness at the pump, and a round of favourable evening news coverage. What they got was rather different. Before the meeting had even begun, the Petrol Retailers Association pulled out. Not quietly, not diplomatically, but loudly and with purpose. Gordon Balmer, the association's executive director, made clear that the reason was not obstruction or arrogance. It was something considerably more pointed. The PRA stated that it wanted the meeting to be private in order to allow a genuine conversation about how the fuel market actually functions. This is a reasonable ask. Industry bodies rarely perform well in front of cameras when the person across the table has already publicly accused them of ripping people off. The optics of that are not difficult to read. But then Balmer said something else. Something that should have landed harder in the press than it appears to have done. He pointed out that members of his association, ordinary petrol station staff working on forecourts up and down the country, had been subjected to abuse from members of the public. Verbal abuse. Hostility. And he attributed this, at least in part, to the language being used by politicians and commentators. Words like rip-offs. Words like profiteering. He described such language as incorrect and inflammatory. He noted that independent retailers are, in many cases, operating on razor-thin margins or even negative margins, meaning they are actively losing money on fuel sales. Let that land for a moment. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has been publicly calling out fuel sellers for profiteering, and independent forecourt workers are being abused in the street as a result, while those same forecourt workers are losing money on the product being sold. The framing and the reality are not just misaligned. They are operating in entirely separate universes. This is not to say that there are no legitimate questions about fuel pricing. There are, and the Competition and Markets Authority has been keeping a close eye on the sector for precisely this reason. The major supermarkets and large fuel retailers do have pricing power that independent operators do not. The supply chain between crude oil prices, wholesale costs, and what appears on the forecourt sign is complex and not always as responsive to falling oil prices as it is to rising ones. These are real concerns worth examining. But there is a considerable distance between a nuanced conversation about pricing dynamics in a concentrated market and going on television to accuse petrol sellers of fleecing drivers. The Chancellor walked that distance in entirely the wrong direction. If you are finding this analysis useful, this is exactly what we do at British Coffers. We take the stories that get 30 seconds on the evening news and pull them apart properly. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a great deal more to come. Now, back to the chaos in Downing Street. After the PRA withdrew, there was what one might generously describe as a rapid recalibration. The government reportedly went back to the association and offered assurances that media would only be present for the opening portion of the meeting, and that the substantive discussions would take place privately. On that basis, the PRA agreed to attend after all. So within the space of a few hours, a meeting intended to project government strength had instead produced a public dispute with the very industry it was supposed to be confronting, a withdrawal, a negotiation, and then an agreement that essentially gave the industry body what it had asked for in the first place. That is not a good look. It is not even a passable look. It is the political equivalent of demanding someone sit down and then quietly pulling out a chair for them when they decline. What makes this particularly awkward for Reeves is the wider political context. The Conservatives and Reform UK have both been pressing the government to abandon its planned 5p increase in fuel duty. With tensions in the Middle East and oil price volatility a genuine concern, the optics of a fuel duty hike are uncomfortable for any chancellor who is simultaneously presenting herself as a champion of working people and hard-pressed families. The government has not yet confirmed whether it will proceed with the hike, but its silence on the matter while simultaneously hosting emergency meetings about fuel prices is the kind of contradiction that erodes trust in the political class more broadly. There is a pattern here that is worth naming. It is the gap between performance and policy. The letter to the CMA, the strong language about not tolerating exploitation, the summoning of industry figures to Downing Street, all of these are the grammar of political action. They signal urgency. They communicate seriousness. They give newspapers something to print and broadcasters something to lead with. But they do not, in themselves, constitute a plan. And when the performance gets ahead of the policy, when the rhetoric is sharper than the thinking behind it, you end up in precisely the situation Reeves found herself in this week. Standing in front of a meeting that nearly did not happen, with an industry that had publicly accused her of inciting abuse against its workers, trying to maintain the air of someone firmly in control. She is not the first politician to make this mistake, and she will not be the last. But she is the Chancellor. The economic credibility of a Chancellor is not a decorative feature of government. It is load-bearing. People need to believe that the person overseeing the nation's finances understands the economy well enough not to confuse a complex pricing market with a straightforward story about corporate greed. The fuel market in particular is one where the gap between public perception and commercial reality is enormous. Margins at independent forecourts are, as the PRA notes, frequently negligible. The independent sector has been under sustained pressure for years. Conflating that reality with the behavior of the largest players in the market, and using language that makes it difficult to draw any distinction at all, is not just imprecise. It is damaging. Damaging to the workers who bear the brunt of public frustration. Damaging to the businesses trying to survive in a difficult environment. And ultimately damaging to the government's own credibility when the full picture becomes clear. The deeper question, the one that this week's events gesture towards without quite arriving at, is whether this government has a coherent approach to business and industry at all. Rachel Reeves came into office presenting herself as a serious economic actor, someone who understood markets, who would not engage in the populist grandstanding that had characterized some of her predecessors. There have been moments where that promise has felt credible. This week was not one of them. Writing letters to competition authorities, using words like rip-offs in public statements, hosting summit meetings that nearly collapse before they begin. This is not an energy policy. It is not even a fuel pricing policy. It is the management of appearances. And appearances, as this week demonstrated rather vividly, have a frustrating tendency to become unmanageable. It is worth watching how the CMA responds to the Chancellor's letter. The authority has already been active in monitoring fuel pricing, and its reports have shown genuine concerns about how wholesale price reductions are passed through to consumers. If the CMA acts, the government will claim credit. If the CMA finds no evidence of widespread wrongdoing, the government will have to quietly move on and hope that the episode is forgotten. Either way, the PRA's central point, that the fuel market is more complicated than political language suggests, will remain true regardless of the outcome. The forecourt workers who have been abused deserve better than to have become collateral damage in a communications exercise. The independent retailers operating on negative margins deserve better than to be lumped in with a narrative of corporate profiteering. And frankly, the public deserves better than a political class that reaches for inflammatory language first and asks questions about market structure second. British politics has a long and distinguished tradition of empty gestures dressed up as decisive action. This week,